Pictures of Hollis Woods. Page 119. 11th picture. On the mountain. I never really drew any of this. I tried not to think about it. It kept coming up inside my head, though, picture after picture of what happened that last day. Saturday. Izzy and the old man off on some antique hunt all the way up to Masonville. Stephen begging me to go fishing. "We'll take the boat all the way down to the rapids," he said. "Bring our lunch." "You go," I said, barely looking up from my drawing. "Gonna spend this whole day with a bunch of pencils in your mouth? Fooling around with bits of paper?" I grinned at him over my shoulder. "Go, Stephen," I thought. "Get out of here." And then he went with a great clatter. Pail and oars, poles and lures, a sandwich dripping tomatoes out the side. "You'll probably be sorry in 2 minutes," he said. He sounded sorry. "Do you mind?" I asked. He grinned. "Not really, but I'll be gone all day, I warn you." He climbed into the rowboat and I watched him, his back bent, leaning over the oars until he was gone. I put everything away carefully, my pad and pencils, cleaned up the tomato mess in the kitchen, put away the box of mallow Mars, shut the refrigerator door, and all the time I was thinking, 3 hours up, 3 hours back. A cinch. I grabbed a sweater just in case. It was getting cold now, and at the last minute I changed my mind and took a few pieces of paper folded in my pocket, a few pencils, green, gray, brown, and black, and the French blue one. Who knew what I could use it for? But it was my favorite. And then I began to climb. It was hot work. I draped the sweater over a tree limb. After a while, I could feel the pole in my ankles, the rub of my sneakers against my heels. I stopped at the halfway point to look down at the house, the snake of the river, and I could see Stephen, a tiny figure in the rowboat. I pulled out some paper, made a quick sketch, and climbed some more. Mud. The old man was right. It was deceptive. I couldn't tell it was there until I stepped into it, once covering the whole of my sneaker. I pulled the shoe out and wiped it off with a few leaves. I was out of breath by the time I almost reached the top, and hungry. Why hadn't I made my own tomato sandwich? There was water, though, a tiny thread of it trickling down from one of the rocks, and I leaned my face into it and drank, and put my wrists under it, and then took the last few steps, and I was there. It opened out, a wide piece of rock, and I danced out onto it, catching my breath. I'd brought dark pencils, but this was a light world. I could see toy houses and the river and even the town of Hancock in the distance. There was a tiny silver lake and a road with miniature cars. "It's Christmas!" I shouted. I said all the things I wanted to. "I'm new," I said. "I'm different." And in my head, I told myself I'd never be mean again. I'd be friendly. I'd go to school and walk up to people. "A new leaf," I said. I was twirling, dizzy, hungry, and the bubbles inside twirling with me, until I took one step too close to the edge in that muddy sneaker, and then I was rolling, feeling the sharp edge of a branch tearing into my arm and a stone gashing into my forehead, and finally I was stopped by a huge boulder a few feet down. The wind had been knocked out of me. I lay gasping. I pulled myself back up. Not so bad, not so terrible, I told myself, wiping the blood out of my eye, except that I knew I'd never be able to walk all the way down by myself. I didn't begin to call Stephen until much later, until the sun had crossed toward the west and I knew it was late afternoon, and I didn't want Izzy and the old man to know I had done such a stupid thing, and even as I called, I knew Stephen couldn't hear me. But he came. Of course he came. Just before sunset, I heard him, or rather, I heard the pickup truck, gears grinding and then stopping, the door slamming, and then he was standing over me. "I knew it," he said. "How?" He narrowed his eyes. "Break any bones?" "Certainly not." "I wasted my whole afternoon," he said. "Felt sorry that you were all alone. Came back and..." "Wasted?" "Right. I figured it out, though. You weren't anywhere." "So why'd you bring the truck?" I asked. "Think I had 3 hours before dark to walk all the way up here to get you?" He shook his head. "I thought you'd been killed." "Just wounded," I said, laughing. We sat on the edge of the rock watching the sun go down. Stephen pointed. Our winter place is somewhere over there. You'll see it soon. To the east, far below, was the summer house, the holly bushes, a blur of green, the golden field, the thread of river. It took my breath away. I want to show you something, I told Stephen. I reached into my pocket for the crumpled up W picture I had taken out of my backpack before I'd left. I have had it since I was 6. We sat on a ledge, our feet dangling, and he smoothed the picture on his knee, stared at it, then looked over at me. We had to find pictures with W words, I said. It's a wishing picture, he said slowly, for a family. I could feel my lips trembling. Oh, Mrs. Evans, I thought. Why didn't you see that? It's too bad you didn't come when you were 6, he smiled. I knew you had to stay with us when you let me win that checkers game. His hair was falling over his forehead and his glasses were crooked, almost hiding his eyes. I thought of the X picture day and walking out of school. I thought of sitting in the park on a swing, my foot digging into the dirt underneath. I run away sometimes, I said. I don't go to school. He kicked his foot gently against the ledge, his socks down over his sneakers. Someone called me incorrigible. Now that I'd begun, I didn't know how to stop. Kids never wanted to play with me. I was mean. Stephen pulled his glasses off and set them down on the ledge next to him. He rubbed the deep red mark in the bridge of his nose. I stopped, looking out as far as I could, miles of looking out. For a moment, I was sorry I'd told him, but he turned, and I could see his eyes clearly, and I wondered if he might be blinking back tears. I wasn't sure, though. He reached out and took my hand. You ran in the right direction this time, didn't you? And that was it. He knew all about me, and he didn't mind. We have to go down now, he said, before they come back and find out. I nodded. I stood up, and I could feel the pain shoot through my ankle. I limped to the pickup truck. I'm glad you came, I said. I could never have walked all the way down. It was a dumb thing to do, he said. Coming up here, Pop would have a fit. And so we went down. Stephen was a sure and careful driver, but it was so steep, and the truck kept going, kept sliding, even with the brake pressed down as hard as he could manage. He pressed and pressed, but the truck gained speed, and just before the end, when we would have been all right, when we would have been fine, the truck tipped. And I could see we were going to go over, and Stephen yelled at me, "Jump, Holly!" The Time with Josie, Chapter 13. Late that afternoon, the snow tapered off and stopped. I took a last look at the picture, pleased with it. Beatrice listening to something Josie is saying, both of them with bags of popcorn in their hands. I sneaked it into my room so that Josie wouldn't see it. I put on all the clothes I could find and Izzy's boots and went outside to sink into the soft snow almost to my knees. The cold was shocking. It stung the inside of my nose and numbed my cheeks. Everything was still. The birds must have found nesting places for the night, and the deer were hiding somewhere deep in the woods. The last slim line of river had frozen. If I hadn't known it was there, I'd have walked right across to the other side. I wondered if the ice would carry my weight yet. I realized I wouldn't be able to pick evergreen or holly branches from the ground. Anything the wind had brought down was under the snow. I'd have to saw off what I could. Josie and Henry were framed in the window waving to me. I reached down to scoop up a handful of white and tossed it at them. Then I trudged over to the shed for the old man's saw and found Stephen's sweater hanging on the knob, encrusted with snow. I didn't even remember leaving it there. I folded it, put it on one of the shelves, reached for the saw, and spent the last bit of daylight hacking away at branches, making sure not to spoil the shapes of the trees. The wind wasn't as strong under the shelter of those trees, and it reminded me of something the old man had told me. Hunters who were lost would pull the tree branches together with rope, bending them to form a shelter. I loved the thought of that, the trees forming a cozy nest. And then I shivered, thinking of being alone. You have Josie, Stephen might have said. I love Josie, I said back. From inside, music spilled from the radio. All I want for Christmas. What I want? What I want? Josie was turning on the lamps now. The house was like a Christmas card with the light shining on the snow. I stood there watching, wondering how far the light might be seen. I reached up for the last branch, snow spraying my face. No one could see the light anyway, I told myself. It faced the river, away from the road, and no one would be on the old man's mountain toward evening after a storm like this. "You're a snowman," Josie said as I trudged onto the porch, staggering under the bulky branches. I pulled off Izzy's waders and rubbed my feet until the feeling came back. Josie danced around me. "I have something for your dinner," she said, delighted with herself. "I was saving it for a surprise." She led me into the kitchen and opened the cabinet over the refrigerator. I thought I knew where everything was, but in back of Izzy's old bowls and mixers was a row of treasures. A box of dried milk, pancake mix, and a jar of applesauce. "Yes," Josie said with satisfaction. "We'll have apple pancakes for dinner with cold milk." My mouth watered. A Christmas Eve dinner. "I'll pay you back, Izzy, every cent, if it takes me the rest of my life." So, Josie cooked for the first time, talking to me over her shoulder about Beatrice. "Ornaments sparkle on the tree, and Beatrice lights the candles?" Every time Josie talked about Beatrice, she seemed to come alive. I thought, Beatrice and her house. I knew she was homesick. "We'll have Christmas here, too," I told her. "I'll set everything up after we eat." But after I'd finished the pancakes covered with dollops of sweet applesauce, my eyes drooped. I was warm and sleepy. "Let's do it all in the morning," I said. "Presents?" Josie said, a secret smile lighting her face. I curled up in bed, looking out the window at a pale moon and trees thick with snow, thinking I'd never seen anything so beautiful. I could see movement at the edge of the trees and sat up to see what it was. And then suddenly, a fox, silvery gray with his tail streaming out in back of him, darted across that open space, crossed the ice, and was gone. "I saw a fox, Stephen. I've never seen a fox before." I lay back, trying to figure out what Josie might have for me. Maybe she'd found another package of food. I fell asleep wondering what it was, what I'd like it to be. Something sweet, something chocolate, or salty. Potato chips. Next morning, the sun was blinding, and the shed glittered like the witch's house in Hansel and Gretel. I lay there, something on the edge of my mind. What was it? Something about the shed. Or was I wondering what the old man would think if he knew I was spending Christmas in his house? I didn't want to think about that, but there was something else. Was it Josie's present for me? An egg was what I really wanted this morning. What I could do with an egg. I'd bake a cake or cookies. I'd whip it up for an eggnog. I'd fry it like a little sun in a pan. I threw on my clothes. The house still smelled of the pancakes from last night. I went into the kitchen. At that moment, the back door opened and Josie came in, her scarf pulled over her forehead, her nose red. I wanted to tell her she shouldn't be out there, that it was too cold, the snow too deep, but I'd sound like the stucco woman. I turned back to the stove. "Cocoa with milk?" I said. We hurried through breakfast, and afterward I went out on the porch to shake the snow off the branches before I brought them inside. I covered the mantelpiece, the sharp pines smelling like Christmas as Josie unwrapped the box of ornaments. "Here's my old Santa Claus." I could hear the tears in her voice as she hung them in the center. "And this one?" She held up a thick pink plastic globe. "Ugly, isn't it?" "It's the only kind we could get during the Second World War." She went on, telling me the history of each one until the mantel was finished and the center of the table held a bowl of holly. "We'll even hang a few of those glittery ornaments over the window to catch the light," I said aloud, and to myself, "Please be happy, Josie." "Presents now?" Josie asked. "Maybe," I said absently. I had caught movement outside as I hung the last clear prism. We watched as 7 or 8 deer wandered in front of the house, making their way toward the evergreens. Suddenly, something disturbed them. Heads back, noses up, they stood stock still for an instant, then scattered. 2 to bound across the river ice as the fox had last night, the others in the opposite direction toward the bridge. I tried to see what had bothered them. I looked toward the evergreens myself, looking back as far as I could. There was no light anywhere, nothing to make me think about a fisherman being out there somewhere. I had a quick thought of the night on the mountain with the flashlights like glowworms above me. It was then I remembered Stephen's sweater, a flash of green in the snow as I backed away from the fisherman that day. I hadn't left it on the doorknob. In the shed, I opened my mouth to ask Josie if she had picked it up when she'd been outside, but Josie would never remember. Maybe I didn't want to know the answer anyway, thinking of the fishermen finding us, and that might happen then. Oh, and what might happen then? 12th picture, a mountain of trouble. I couldn't get warm, even though I wore a robe and Izzy's sweater on top of that. Every time I drifted off to sleep that August night, I'd start thinking someone was there. I'd look around the dark room, but it was empty. I'd close my eyes again, and then I'd think I was falling, my head jerking, arms up, legs braced, a scream in my throat, and that feeling in my chest as we went over the side. But I really didn't sleep. I kept going over it. The sound first, a screeching metal, tearing, as if the truck were dying, the wheel swerving, a tree slowing us down, its branches cracking, breaking, leaves covering the windshield, a rock ripping at the underside, the truck bouncing now, not so muddy, gravel and roots and Stephen's hands off the wheel, the sound of glass shattering, a tire spinning. And then everything was still. We were almost all the way down the old man's mountain, and next to me, Stephen, with his head on the wheel. I reached for him, his heart pounding, shook his shoulder. "Don't do this, Stephen," I said. "Don't be dead." I pushed him back, his head against the seat now, his face white in the dusky inside of the truck. Not a mark on him that I could see, but he was hurt, I was sure. Really hurt. He wasn't dead, though. There was a thin pulsing on the side of his neck, his eyes moving under the broken glasses. I took them off gently and heard him say something. "Loon, sister," maybe. I could hear the sound of the S. Maybe it was sorry? "Stephen, I have to get help." I watched him for another moment, then scrambled out of the truck, feeling the pull of my ankle, telling myself I had to do it, had to go as quickly as I could. I began the climb back up, wondering how long it would take to get down the mountain road, cross the bridge, and reach the house. And then I thought, no telephone. What then? I was almost there when I saw the sweep of headlights going across the bridge, Izzy and the old man coming home. When they saw me, Izzy leaned out the window calling, "I bought dishes, Hollis! You're going to love them!" And then she stopped. "Child, you're bleeding." "The truck," I said. "What has he done?" the old man said. "What has he done now? You can hardly walk." It seemed to take forever before lights flickered on the mountain and cars began to park diagonally down below. Turret lights turned and glowed, and an ambulance came all the way from Walton, its siren screaming. They brought Stephen down at last, but all I could see was one foot, the sneaker, the socks falling over his ankles. A policeman shook his head, talking to Izzy and the old man as I stood to one side, out of everyone's way. "If it wasn't your mountain, if it wasn't private property, your boy would be in trouble. As it is, Izzy's voice cut in. "We have to hope he'll be all right." And I had looked over my shoulder at the old man's face, his clenched jaw. In the emergency room, a doctor took 5 stitches to close my forehead and wrapped an ace bandage around my ankle. Stephen was somewhere inside, too, and I didn't even know what was happening to him. We went home later that night, much later, Izzy and I. Izzy to stay just long enough to put me to bed, to cover me and tell me it would be all right, to touch my cheek and my chin. "Just sleep, Hollis," she said. "Everything will seem better in the morning." And then she went back to the hospital to wait. I thought about the stucco woman. She wouldn't have been surprised at the trouble I had caused. She would have seen it coming. Would Stephen have driven the truck to the top of the mountain if I hadn't been there? And the arguing between Stephen and the old man. What had Izzy said? Worse this summer? I had messed up the whole family. Before it was light, I packed my things in the backpack. They didn't all fit, so I left a small pile of odds and ends and the bathing suit that was drying on the line. I tore off a sheet of paper from my drawing pad and wrote the note. It was my fault, all of it. I wanted to see the mountain. I'm going back to Long Island. Please don't come after me. I don't want to be a family after all. I looked back as I left to take a picture of it all in my mind, thinking how strange it was to use my running money to run back to the stucco lady. It was even stranger that she let me walk in there so easily, clucking over my bandage, taking me to the doctor a week later to have the stitches out. Emmy, agency hotshot, came to see me to tell me Stephen was going to be all right. His ribs are broken, she said, and the bones in his arms are fractured. While her mouth was still open, ready to say something else, I told her, I never want to go back. I never want to see any of them again. She tried to find out why, but when I just kept looking out the window, banging my feet on the chair rung, she sighed and let me stay with the stucco woman. I didn't do that either. I lasted there through most of September, and then I ran. The Time with Josie, Chapter 14. My cousin Beatrice would love this, Josie said, looking around the room. If only... I'd never seen anything so beautiful, so Christmassy either. Pine branches were everywhere. We'd found candles, maybe a dozen, and lighted all of them. The ornaments sparkled in the light. And then I thought of what Josie had begun to say. If only what? I asked. She shrugged a little. Beatrice and I spent every Christmas together. She remembers things for me when I forget. Things about when we were young. Her forehead wrinkled. Fishing off the jetties. I felt a lump in my throat. She'll be home someday, I said, but I wondered when that would be. Next year? Josie said. I looked out the window. I didn't like to think about next year. Where would we be then? Just a minute, I told her. Close your eyes. I went down the hall for the picture I'd drawn and laid it on the table to flicker in the candlelight. Josie herself, I said, with Beatrice. She drew in her breath, leaning over it, running one finger along the edge. We're young, she smiled up at me. And look at that popcorn machine. Head tilted, she spotted Henry batting a piece of popcorn across the floor. You have to keep looking to see everything, she said. She stood up then and pattered away from me into the kitchen. She came back with a round tin in her hand. This is from Santa Claus. I touched the tin. Where did you find this? Izzy's hard candies. Izzy standing on the porch one sunny afternoon holding a tin out to me. Lemon drops and orange. They'll make you sweet, make you loving. She had leaned forward to touch my shoulder. You always have a lump in one cheek, Stephen told me days later as I worked my way through the candy. It's going to freeze like that. Oh, Izzy. Oh, Stephen. I opened the tin and held it out to Josie. You get first pick. Another thing I had to pay back. I couldn't just take Izzy's candies. Take them, I suddenly remembered Izzy saying with a sweep of her arm. Take anything, Hollis. I've always wanted a daughter. I have a real present for you, Josie said, round the candy in her mouth. I looked after her, wondering, as she went into Izzy and the old man's bedroom and came back with something in her arms. She's finished at last. It was my tree figure with her seagrass hair cascading down her back, almost half the size of Josie. She looked older than I was, but as I touched her face, the small nose, the large eyes, the tiny scar on the forehead, the arms out, I could see it was me. But not really me. I looked closer, studying those eyes that were so sad it hurt to look at them, ran my fingers over those outstretched arms. Giving arms, Josie said, nodding, bone thin like one of the little birds that perched on the evergreen trees. I reached out to her, feeling those small shoulders, and hugged her to me. Tears burned my eyes. She's beautiful, I said. Do you think she looks like you? I held her out. She's not as tough, I said, trying for a smile. She doesn't look like a mountain of trouble. Josie shook her head. Maybe you're tough when you need to be tough, but trouble? What would I ever have done without you? Josie put her hand under my chin and tilted it so that I had to look at her. I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. But I'm not, I began, but she broke in. Not good? Not kind? Not there when you're needed? Not anxious to be loved? You know that's not so. I did cry then, but just for a moment. If I had let myself go, I would have had a hard time stopping. And then I saw that Josie was crying too. I know you want to go home, I said, a jumble of thoughts in my mind. I wanted to say that we could be a family here, but she wanted to be in her own house, wanted to make Christmas cookies with Beatrice and spend Tuesdays and Thursdays at the movies making popcorn. We sat on the couch, Henry on Josie's lap, watching the candles glow in the late afternoon light. The fire in the fireplace sent warm shadows over the wood floor and the walls, and next to me, Josie was closing her eyes. Her head went back to rest again against the couch, and she was asleep. I sat there too, half dozing, remembering that Stephen's birthday was the next day. It hurt to think about it. I stood up slowly, quietly, and went into his room. I picked up the blurry picture from his dresser, half of the photo dark, the rest all blues and greens, with the faint figure in the center. It was the river, of course. I saw it then, with the holly bushes on the bank and just the faintest view of the old man's mountain reaching up and back. There was the rowboat, and I was in it. How could I not have seen that the other day? "Hey, stop rowing," he said. "I'm going to take your picture." I looked up at him, feeling the sun on my face, feeling the happiness down to my toes as he stood at the river's edge and snapped the picture. "You've got a smiley face," he said. "We could put you on a stamp and sell it all over branches." "Too bad you didn't take your thumb off the lens," I told him. "Too bad you dropped the oar," he said. "It's floating away." I put the picture back carefully, then went downstairs for sweaters and pulled my jacket off the hook. Something fell out as I did. It was the shell I had picked up the first time I had seen Josie's ocean. I held it up to my face before I put it back into my pocket. I needed to be outside. I needed to be cold, so cold I couldn't think of anything but the ice and the snow. Anything. That's what the stucco woman would say. Oh, whoops. Anything. That's what the stucco woman would say. 13th picture, the conference room. For all I know, this picture might still be in the agency conference room. It's a drawing of a small office with beige paneling on the walls. The paneling is fake wood. There's a table in the center, someone's initials, TR, gouged out of the wood. The picture isn't finished, but Emmy and the mustard woman didn't know that. They thought the girl sitting at the table was me. Of course it wasn't me. This girl was laughing. She was just make-believe. I wasn't laughing when I sat there. I was sitting as straight as I could, but I could feel my knees shaking. "Mr. Reagan wants to talk to you," Emmy said. I shook my head, never looking at her, sketching on the paper. She leaned forward. "He's come all the way down here, Holly." "Hollis. Just see what he has to say." I shook my head again, but Emmy patted my hand and was out the door. And then he was there, standing in front of me, and I still didn't look up. "I'm sorry," I said in a voice so low I wasn't sure he heard me. "It was Stephen's fault," he said. "No," I said. "He took the truck." I could see him wave his hand. "Hollis, it doesn't matter. We just want you home." I thought about standing up. I felt like putting my arms around him, then going out to the car with him. I thought of what it would be like to drive up to their front door. "I didn't tell Izzy and Stephen I was coming," he said. "If I had, they would have come too. I had to make sure you wanted to be with us first." Izzy would be standing at the door and Stephen next to her. We'd be hugging each other, all of us. There would be pancakes and hard candy. But that was just for a moment. "It wasn't Stephen's fault," I said. "I went up the mountain first." "It doesn't make any difference." He was blaming Stephen. If I went home with him, they'd always blame Stephen. "He thinks you're perfect," Stephen had said, before I could change my mind. I shook my head. "I think I'll stay down here." He tried to talk me out of it. I wasn't even hearing what he said. I stopped drawing. My hands were clenched under the table, and I never once looked up at him. After a while, he left. Emmy came back in with tears in her eyes. You want tough? I asked. I'll show you tough.